Linux and its community almost broke me, because over the last week and a half, I was trying out a video idea where I would take a computer running Linux and use it as a replacement for my Mac Studio as an editing rig. And obviously that video did not come out. So today, I'm going to dive into why and just generally talk about my experience with Linux after having not really played with it in almost a decade. So let's get into it. Now, because I generally like to start out with the positives, I will say that my experience with Linux, the operating system, when it comes to web browsing, script writing, and things of that nature were great. Honestly, it was amazing how much this operating system is capable of doing, considering the fact that I didn't pay a cent for it. Now, I did struggle initially with some installs, trying out things like Manjaro. I tried Mint. Eventually, I settled in on PopOS. It's a derivative of Ubuntu, but there's a lot more that is sort of user-friendly, at least in my opinion, and there's a key thing that I'll talk about a little bit later that really drove me to choosing PopOS over the other operating systems. Now, for the setup itself, I chose a slightly older PC because I didn't want to go installing it on any of my newest PCs, and I figured that while there would be a hit to my render times, I was more looking at how the system was to just use on a regular basis, like I use my Mac Studio, and then, of course, how it is to edit on, not counting any sort of hiccups due to the hardware. Now, when I say the hardware is a little bit dated, I mean that I'm running a 4790K i7 from Intel, as well as 32 gigabytes of DDR3 memory, and the newest part in the machine was supposed to be an RX 580. However, we'll talk about why that didn't work out in a little bit. I ended up settling on a GTX 970 for the Win Edition from EVGA, and that's the build. And of course I have an SSD running it with 2 hard drives for mass storage. Like I said, I wasn't going to count any sort of performance hiccups when it came to editing because I knew that the system was going to be significantly slower than what I already had. My main focus was just using the machine on a lightweight OS like Ubuntu, or in this case PopOS, and seeing how it performed on the day-to-day, while occasionally being asked to use some more advanced tasks. And again, like I said earlier, I just want to stress the fact that the operating system itself, when it comes to general use, is honestly really impressive for the fact that it's free. If I didn't need to do video editing on a regular basis, I would probably not even really care if I was doing my script writing, document typing, general tasks on a Linux system. However, the problems started to arise when I did ask it to do more than that. Now, DaVinci Resolve was my editor of choice when it came to going onto Linux, because I've used it before on Windows. It is reasonably good on Windows. I've used it on macOS. I still prefer Final Cut, and when it eventually comes to the iPad Pro, I'll probably end up using it significantly more since we still don't have Final Cut on the iPad Pro. But when it came to using it on Linux, this is where the issues really started for me. So as I said earlier, I picked an RX 580 as my main graphics card because from the research I did independently of going onto forums, it seemed as though NVIDIA was only really going to work if I chose the NVIDIA-specific version of PopOS. So I figured I'd want to try something like Mint or Ubuntu, or if I was really feeling daring, I'd try out Manjaro, which is based on Arch. So I threw an RX 580 in there, and everything installed fine, but then I went to boot up DaVinci Resolve. The RX 580 wouldn't show up, and it was apparently an OpenCL issue, but with it being an OpenCL issue, I would have initially assumed that maybe it was just a driver issue, so I tried to find drivers, and that required me to go and mess around with the terminal. And I am generally a Mac user. I've used terminal on the Mac because Mac is Unix-based, and that was pretty familiar to me. I did find it kind of odd that I couldn't just double-click a driver to install it, but I suppose that's not the Linux way. But when I would do that, it would either pause up and say that it already has a driver installed, or if I tried to install the Pro version, it would tell me that I had to go through all these other steps first, and then upon completing those steps, it would just kick me back and say, nope, still not good enough, we're not going to install the drivers, better luck next time. And it did this consistently across every distro I tried, even the one that I ended up settling on, which was PopOS, and I couldn't figure out why, so I hit up the forums. This is where the community for Linux almost broke me. Now, I'm a Mac user. I am more than familiar with the macOS elitism and gatekeeping that everybody talks about. There's a reason why macOS only accounts for about 14% of the user base. That and the fact that Windows is licensed to basically anything with a CPU that's newer than 15 years. So when I ask a question and the first few answers are very elitist and telling me I should already know these things, it's kind of just water off my back like a duck. I am used to that kind of stuff, and in fact, I am more familiar with seeing it on macOS, so I moved on. But then it continued, and I got to the point where I felt like if I wasn't born with a fedora on my head and a neckbeard on my chin with a keyboard in my hand, then I shouldn't be using Linux. And that was not the best experience for somebody who wanted to try out a new thing for the first time in a long time, because when you're trying to get new community members and you're trying to get people who actually want to engage in something that you are also passionate about, you can't just assume that they should know what you already know. If you have years of experience and they have none, you have to dial back your expectations on their understanding of your passion. I mean, being treated like this on a forum where I really was hoping to actually gain knowledge on the operating system really just shined a light on why people make these memes about Linux users, because Linux does have a fairly low adoption rate. And I understand that part of that is because of the fact that Macs and PCs ship with their own respective operating systems, so people don't really feel as though they need to install another OS. But on top of that, for the casual user, the person that Linux people are constantly saying should adopt Linux, being treated like you already know everything and then being berated when you reveal that you don't doesn't really make you feel like you want to continue to use this operating system when Mac users, as elitist as we can be, still offer basic entry-level recommendations for simple problems. And Windows users, good God, you have massive forums because God knows Windows has quite enough issues as it is that need resolution, and people will happily give you those resolutions because suffering together is better than suffering alone. And like, I understand that every community has these kinds of users. I understand that Mac users have that toxic community that just berates people for using anything other than their precious macOS. And I understand that Windows users have those toxic users who think that because Windows is an industry standard and has the largest market share of any operating system, that nothing else should exist, and Microsoft should go back to the 90s when they were being sued and have antitrusts thrown at them. But when your community is so small, you would think that it would be tightly knit enough that people would want to help each other out. And I'm sure there are people like that. Believe me, I had quite a few people offer support, only to be overshadowed and basically buried by the people who thought that I should know this already, or I should just get the f*** out and go play on my iPad, which actually I ended up doing so that I could write the script for this video. Now, I'm not going to call out the specific forum that this happened on. I'm also not going to bring up any of the specific users because, one, them and the horse they rode in on. Two, I know that there are genuinely good people there who just want to help, but really just got buried by the shitpost users. And three, speaking of shitposts, I ended up getting banned from the forum because once I realized I wasn't going to get any help, I just plastered a bunch of different Linux memes all over the forum page. So, yeah, overall, sorry, but not sorry. But I kind of wrote myself off into a tangent there. The reason why I was originally going onto the forum was because of these graphical issues, because of the fact that while I did have a decent graphics card in the system, better than what I ended up actually having to use, and while I did do all the things that I thought I was supposed to do with sudo commands and apt-get and all that kind of stuff, I still couldn't use my editor of choice for Linux. And so eventually I just figured maybe it's the graphics card, even though AMD seems to be the one that everybody wants to use or should use on Linux. So let's try something else. Which, by the way, off script here, one of the most common things that I was told when I was asking why my video editor wasn't identifying the graphics card was, well, don't use that editor. I'm sorry, but that's like saying, hey, this car really guzzles a lot of gas, but I did pay the money to have it and use it, and I like everything else about it. Is there any way to fix the gas mileage? And then having somebody come up and go, yeah, just don't drive that car. off. Anyway, I took the RX 580 out and I threw in a GTX 970 for the Win Edition, and very quickly realized that Mint wasn't going to play nice with it without a lot of tweaking and a lot of driver work, so I switched over to the NVIDIA version of Pop! OS, and it worked almost perfectly. In fact, you had the NVIDIA drivers already installed, and it could show you temperature, fan curve, clock speeds, whole 9 yards. And the best part, when I finally installed DaVinci Resolve 18.1, it came right up, recognized the graphics card, and selected the render engine for CUDA. We were golden. Or so I thought. This I can't really blame Linux on, but also I kind of can. Because Linux is free and open source, from what I was able to surmise from my research, it seems as though certain codecs just don't work. And those codecs include some of the more common ones that I use, like XAVC on Sony, and of course, whatever Apple records on. I think it's H.265 HEVC. So after all that work and all that trial and error and all of the emotional damage of trying to figure out what I was doing wrong on the forums, turns out that it just doesn't work. And obviously, no, this video is not going to be edited on the Linux machine that I put together because the video formats I use aren't supported, and in order to get it to work, I'd have to convert it over to something that is usable that requires another computer to do anyway. So after all that work, after playing around with all these drivers, after taking God knows how much abuse from the community, or at least from that specific forum, changing the graphics cards, playing with drivers, trying all these different apt-get functions and everything, I still couldn't get this to do what I originally intended. And what I originally intended was to make a video talking about how I built a Linux machine to, as seamlessly as possible, replace my Mac Studio. And I couldn't do it. And I'm sure there are ways of doing it. I'm sure that you could sail the high seas and get some codecs, or maybe even buy a codec plugin pack for whatever editor you choose, which in my case is DaVinci Resolve, so I don't care if you tell me, oh, well, just don't use that. It's what I use. I even found some codec tools that you could pull in from the repository through the terminal, and they still didn't work. So yeah, at least in terms of heavier use, which is what I asked my Mac Studio to do every so often, more often now than before, I can't recommend Linux. I can't. And I'm sure that there are professionals out there who do use it on a daily basis, and I'm sure there are people way smarter than me who seamlessly integrate everything they want right into Linux without thinking twice. But I couldn't do that, and because my videos tend to work on a fairly tight deadline, especially considering that I dedicated a week and a half to this video project and it didn't happen, yeah, that's what I got to report. I can't use Linux as a direct replacement for day-to-day tasks plus some heavier use case, so I'm still sticking with my Mac Studio. End of story. And the last thing I'll say to just round out this video is more specifically going to address my experience with the Linux community, which I already kind of talked about, but I'm just going to say this. If you are part of the Linux community and you are genuinely trying to help people understand Linux and make the most of their system, I appreciate you. You are easily the kind of community member that I would happily talk to. But when a new user's first experience with Linux is that of just verbal abuse, talking about how I should already know this, or if I don't understand something this basic, just go back and play on your iPad, or what's wrong with you, this isn't too hard, it doesn't leave a good taste in your mouth. Oh, and God forbid you mention the fact that you're kind of familiar with the terminal because macOS is based on Unix and you're a Mac user, because that's like telling a flat earther that the earth is round. No matter what you try to say, you're wrong. And look, I'm not wrapping this video up by bashing the entire Linux community. Like I said, the few users who actually stopped to try and help me, I appreciate you, and I would love to talk more about this stuff if I ever try to use Linux again. But the fact that the vocal majority of your community are toxic users doesn't really make me want to go and try Linux again. I'm sorry, but that's just how it is. I don't know. At the end of the day, I might try this again sometime in the future. I might try it on a different system, even though I don't think my system really should be that hard to run Linux on. But either way, thank you all so much for watching this video. I look forward to your comments down below. Of course, I'm sure there's going to be some Linux users down there who will bash this video. Let's see, because there's others where that's already happened. So fingers crossed that won't happen, but either way, thanks for watching. If you did enjoy this video, make sure to like and subscribe. I got a lot more stuff planned. This video changed into something totally different, but we got some more stuff planned that's back to normal, so hopefully you guys will stick around for that. Again, comment, subscribe, like, I've already said that. I sell merch as well. You can check that out in the link down below. Hopefully you guys will like that, and that's all I got. I'll see you all in the next video. Make sure to be there, and have a good one.